everything that I think we all experience as true comes from what we've experienced in our lives up until that point, what we've been exposed to. Like, we all know, right? We all know that we're deeply embedded in the worlds into which we have been born and the ideas to which we have been exposed. And so, like, in retrospect, right, this is me looking back at who I was. My experience of truth just came from being born into like full on secularism, like full on the consequences of the arc of the last 500 years with, the collapse of traditional religion, the pluralization of religious forms, the rise of nihilism, the rise of this supposed divide between religion and science. I mean, I was just like born into a world where what the world is made of is material stuff, and anything that you try to interpret beyond what you can see and touch is a fantasy. Now, in retrospect, I understand that that's like a wild oversimplification. I don't believe it anymore, but anything beyond what I could see and touch was a fantasy. And I appreciate you saying that, you see me in even past me as a truth seeker, because I was, I wasn't. I think we all are, right? And we're so motivated and we're so loyal and honest and passionate about our ideas of truth because we think they are real. They have to be real, right? I very, very, very much, I knew that I would have loved for God to be real, but I couldn't believe in it because it was a fantasy piled on top of the real world. And that was just like the metaphysics that I was born with. And I am working today, all day, every day. I'm still working on trying to pick that apart and inhabit the world in a way that is not so empty and reductive, because it doesn't have to be that way. That's the metaphysics that I was born into.
So as a sober-minded intellect who was a truth seeker and you believed that anything beyond what you could see, touch, taste, smell, feel was a fantasy. Now, a part of embracing atheism or naturalism or that kind of, I will say the word reductionistic view, is that there are certain things about yourself that you would have to say are fantasy as well, like the ability to choose freely, or objective moral values and determining what is right or wrong, or your own consciousness. Things, that sustainable you who is not physical, that sustains throughout time. There, and of course, things like meaning, that thing that you were wrestling with, which I guess as an atheist you would have to call a fantasy in some point, that there must have been a dissonance between knowing that you are a meaning-seeking person, but yet meaning on its own does not hold objective value within the naturalistic worldview. So I'm wondering, how did you live out this view of the world where everything beyond your senses was fantasy?
Well, it was and that's why it sucked so much. I didn't carry any illusions about objective, like I didn't believe in objective truth or value.
What were some of those intellectual rocks that were convincing to you that allowed you to move forward?
One important thing that happened was throughout all of my living alongside people of faith in institutions and staying up all night, talking about metaphysics and the Trinity, and was that I learned that religious belief is incredibly intelligent and rational and intellectually so fruitful and deep and rich. One of my doctoral supervisors, Alistair McGrath, I remember giving a talk and just talking about how rich the intellectual life was in Christianity, and now I understand. Like, I've always just loved that. I thought that my friends were perfectly smart and I loved being around them, but I was never going to believe. It just didn't make sense to me. Like intellectual honesty from my point of view was secularism. And it was just kind of like a gap that would never be breached, that I would never understand how other people could possibly believe that something beyond what I could see and touch was real. That just, how could that possibly? So I knew it was rational. And I also knew that I was miserable, like more or less. Again, my life was amazing, but existentially, I was in pain.
Right.
And I became intrigued with pragmatism as a school of philosophy, and specifically the work of William James. James was very interesting because James was writing just a couple decades after Darwin. And after Darwin came on the scene and the 19th century happened, like so many people in this intellectual milieu were despairing of knowledge. They thought, oh, humans, we can't possibly have any kind of theological view anymore because Darwin has disproved knowledge, has disproved the image of God. We are just apes, we're those fleshy blobs. And James came along and he was like, wait. No, like knowledge has involved feeling all along. Knowledge has involved feeling all along. It's not dead. We just need to validate it. We just need to see it as valid another way. Like it's not dead. It's just imperfect, which is funny because that's what medieval theologians were saying all along. Like God is perfect. Human knowing is imperfect. And it was only during the Enlightenment that thinkers constructed this idea, this hope that human knowledge could be perfect. And then we had all this despair. Oh no, human knowledge isn't perfect. We can't believe in anything. And James was like, no. We just need to accept that human knowledge is imperfect. And I was like, yeah, okay. And then James also says that this intellectual view, this secular view, this purely naturalistic view, well, guess what? It's not actually any closer to truth than anything else. And it's motivated by a fear of being wrong. And I realized that I had been terrified of making a wrong claim my entire life, like terrified. And so I call it epistemic reticence. Like my way to truth was to make as few truth claims as humanly possible. And James says, but wait, there are certain things that you cannot tell if they are true or not unless you believe them first. Like jumping a mountain pass. You have to believe you can before you can jump it. You get the evidence later. You don't get the evidence first, you get the evidence later. And he points this out in the middle of also saying, look, those of you who are being as epistemically reticent as possible, who think that you're being loyal to truth by only making claims about what you can see and touch, guess what? You're making claims about morals and about metaphysics all day long. You're assuming what an object is, you're assuming what consciousness is, you're making all these assumptions about what's real. And you're making all these assumptions about what's good because you go out the front door, you talk to people, you choose your words. These are like ethics are woven into the fabric of your daily life, as are metaphysics. And so, James says, since you're making moral and metaphysical claims anyway, why not dare to believe something that might be true, especially if it is intellectually rigorous and it might make you happier and it might make you a better person. Ultimately, he says, look, if there is something that is intellectually rigorous that can make you a happier or a better person, you are not just licensed, and this was the key point for me, but you are obliged to believe it.
Mm.
So I literally decided to try to change the fabric of how I've been made. I think of myself like a radio antenna or a station. I've been sort of dialed into this secular nihilistic frequency my whole life. But I can actually choose to interpret the world differently and change my fabric, my existential fabric, to be open to God, to be open to new truths. I have decided to dare to believe in God, to see if God is present in my life. And I think that God is. I'm loving and enjoying reading the Bible. I'm reading a study Bible, which I think is very important. And I'm doing it because I think getting to know Christ is very important. I need to lean into the more relational aspects of the faith because I'm such a, head, brain in the sky, intellectual. But yeah, so I would just say that, like, pay attention to the emotional bits and the intellectual bits, and just note what's speaking to you and what isn't, and let yourself. I will say one more thing, and then I'll stop. Um, I was able to start walking into faith because I started paying attention to what feels like joy. And I define joy as a feeling of celebratory rightness and homecoming. And I started following that because I wanted to be joyful. And I started following that, and it led me to God. And now I think it is God. But that's the thing that I listen to pulling on me, trying to figure out what steps to take next.